We do have a one Richie Hawtin sitting next to us, and I'd like you all to welcome him.
And we have my friend Itaro sitting next to me, who we're going to introduce later, but he's the visual side of my team, and we'll get there somewhere in the next hour.
How big is that team?
Yeah, I'm trying to keep my team to all be able to sit at the dinner table together, which I think,
If you're Jesus, that can be a pretty big
yeah,
table.
but it gets over 10 or 12 people, and you're with your friends having dinner or something, and the conversations start to go in different places, and it's very easy to the one side of the table to get alienated from the other side. So 12, 14 people is really pushing it, and I think with full-time people and part-time and friends, we're around that right now. So yeah, it takes quite a lot of dedicated people to bring the shows that we're doing to fruition. A lot of development time in the beginning, a lot of time once they're ready to go, and a lot of time just taking it from one place to another, because we do a lot of actually different type of shows, and they all have their challenges, and yeah, and of course, traveling the world isn't an easy. It's not just about jumping on a plane when we've got equipment and team members coming from different places, and sometimes we have people going to one gig while we're doing another gig for pre-setup and checking everything. So yeah, it's quite complicated. Luckily, it seems very simple because we have a great team, but yeah, it takes a lot of logistics and management.
And all of that on the back of what started with like two turntables and a mixer, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think we all start in simple situations. Is that photo on? Is there an old archaic black and white mixer on one of these TV screens?
Not yet, but
No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah.
that's
So
a
that's-
pretty
that-
heavyweight one, right?
It's heavier than the mixers are now, but that's kind of where I started in 1990 something, 1980, 87, 88. Around that time, I started DJing in the basement of my mom and dad's house in Windsor, Canada, which is right across the border from Detroit. Luckily, just across the border from Detroit, because that's where I spent a lot of time as a teenager going to, and eventually DJing and bumping into a lot of very important people in the electronic techno community. Around that time, you had, the beginnings of careers of Derek May and Kevin Saunderson and Juan Atkins and a whole gang of other techno supporters. And as a kid, I was just trying to follow, what they were doing. I think.
How did you learn about them?
Well, the techno community or electronic music scene has been quite large now. But at that moment, there was probably a couple hundred people into electronic music in Detroit. So if you went to any of the clubs, you just very quickly started seeing the same people on the dance floor, in the DJ booth. And it was very, I think how I play now, how I try to conduct my business, how I try to connect with people, all comes from those early days, because it was such a small community, and there was no types of hierarchy. It was a very level playing field, A couple of years later, when I was DJing in Detroit, you'd have Kevin Saunderson or Derek May come over, and they'd be like, "Oh, here's a white label," or even sometimes they had test reel-to-reels, or they had actually what was called a metal master at that time. It was kind of a pre-mastered copy. Hey, see how this inner city sounds, how the vocals sound, and it was super cool, And I never really wanted to be well, maybe I wanted to be a musician or be on stage. I think every kid thinks at one time, to do that. But I was pretty introverted, and I didn't think I was kind of cut out for that type of, being an entertainer. But meeting all these...
Especially since some of those guys are pretty outgoing.
Yeah. Well, Derek, Kevin, all those guys, they're all like football players and baseball players, kind of the jocks of the team. And they were really like, definitely more outgoing than I was. I was happy, to meet these guys who are so down to earth, but also happy to, later on disappear into the DJ booth, which was in the corner of the club. And only the real music geeks were looking at that person if they could find them. And it was about a dance floor experience. So it was definitely way before the DJ as a, again, entertainer or a DJ as a star. So, but even, back to this mixer, why I kind of bringing it up, there's been a lot of development of effects and pushes and machiners and people using equipment in the DJ booth. But for me, it was very... From the beginning, playing two records on top of each other wasn't really enough. And by watching, especially Derek comes to mind, like when Derek May was playing and still does in the late 80s, sometimes he would have a 808 drum machine or a 909 next to him, sometimes a cassette deck, sometimes, many times a reel-to-reel. But whatever mixer he was using, and I think probably I bought this mixer because he had this mixer. I'm sure it was connected somehow. He was always working the EQ and taking just, highlighting just the mids or the low end of one record to another. And that philosophy, that style of DJing in Detroit at that moment really was burned into my brain. And every step of the way in my career, I've tried to find new ways of making records sound different or making me excited in how I play. So it was, the first time I stepped really behind the decks in a club, which was at the Shelter in Detroit, I had that mixer, and I even had a little stomp box delay unit from my studio. So
you already had a studio.
I already had a studio there. It was already basically, I didn't have the drum machine. My effects are now in the computer, but the idea was already there, and that just seemed to be common. What is commonplace now was even then, and I'm talking 1988, 89, in Detroit at least, because that was my only perspective at that moment. That was already commonplace there.
Was Windsor in the vicinity of the Detroit FM signals?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. Because before I started kind of venturing out to Detroit to go night clubbing, I think we had at that moment one radio station, maybe two, and one TV station in Windsor that we could pick up that was actually Canadian. And everything else, the other 8 or 9 channels at that moment, were all coming from Detroit. So, and radio played an incredible, important role for that early inspiration, because if I don't know who's from America here, but at that moment, Detroit radio was so progressive. 5 nights a week you had a guy called Jeff Mills under the name The Wizard playing techno music at, I think, 8 o'clock till 8:30 or 9 o'clock, on the biggest urban station in Detroit. So we were tuning into that. 5 days a week at lunchtime, there was something called the Midday Cuisine Mix, which was basically an hour of house music for everyone to listen to on their lunch breaks. And it was pretty hard not to turn the radio on and hear a Chicago acid house record, or Jeff playing a electronic, say like a Nitsarev UK industrial record and Ministry, and then into hip hop, and then into a Derek May track, and into a Frankie Knuckles track. It was all mixed and mashed together. and that mixing and matching, when Jeff Mills would play, and in half an hour on the radio, he would go through like 100 records, and then watching Derek play in the club and mashing and hitting the EQ, that mix and mashing of music and styles and frequencies was what turned what made the dance hall go absolutely crazy,
Who gave you your first break there?
My first break?
Yeah, as a DJ.
My girlfriend of the time. She was my biggest fan, and she was so determined to get me a DJ job that she drove one of the club owners absolutely paralytic until he finally decided to shut her up by giving me a job. At that moment, I think I had some BPMs written on my sleeves to remember what mixed well together and things like that. I was definitely probably out of my basement before I should have been. But that's actually still part of how I play, meaning that I don't do very much preparation in my music or for new technologies. When Machina came out a couple of years ago, I think the day after I set it up at Time Warp and, hammered on it and to see what was happening. And the same thing with Push. So it's, sitting at home and practicing definitely is good. I did do that in the very early days, but getting in front of a crowd and getting that feedback and that momentum is where you really learn your skills, because you're normally not playing by yourself. Even if you're in a room by yourself and you're broadcasting, there's some kind of connection there, and there's, you need that to really go to the next level as any type of performer, to be thrown into strange and exciting situations.
Can you recall the first time you played outside of Detroit? Or outside of Windsor, for that matter?
Probably it was like Toronto or something. Like at that time, the Midwestern United States, actually up into Toronto, down to Cincinnati, Chicago, was, really had an incredibly vibrant pre-rave scene. So it wasn't uncommon to jump in the car and drive 4, 5, 6 hours, do a gig, come back, and but it's like back to the comment of getting in front of a crowd. Playing. Usually, the first crowd that you play for often is maybe house party or something where your friends are, and they're all your supporters, and they're going to be so excited. It's going to be in a way a magical experience, even if you kind of fuck up. But once you go into a bigger situation where it's not all your friends, and they're going to be critical about how you're playing, and they're going to stop dancing if you play, not so well, is another huge step. And that was what was happening as I started to leave Detroit and go, in a couple of hours radius, that you had to really be, well, okay, if they're dancing, they really like it. They don't know you. You're just some stranger that's just pulled up, take that feedback, take the good with the bad, and take that journey with them.
Were you ever in Europe before you got to play there?
Yeah, I was born in the UK, so I spent quite a lot of time there until I was 9 or 10 years old. And I went around 88, 89 during the kind of what they call the summer of love in the UK, and did some parties, and we're just hanging out and just checking how it was. So I don't think I was actually ready for the first moment that I played overseas, because that was another level of anticipation for probably both sides. And it's just outside of your comfort zone. The further away you go from your friends and what you're used to, the more challenging but sometimes the more inspiring it can be.
What were the first places that you played out in Europe?
Definitely, I think the UK. Yeah, I would say I had a lot of gigs in the UK in probably 1990, 91, and then also a little bit. I think the first gig in Europe was in Amsterdam, and then shortly afterwards was Berlin and Frankfurt, and up into Hamburg, and that was a lot on the strength of the records I was making at that moment. We had our +8 Records label with myself and John Acquaviva and Kenny Larkin and Daniel Bell. And yeah, we kind of made a pilgrimage to Europe to play, because even though we were in Detroit and Windsor and surrounded by a lot of incredible labels and records that were coming out from the Detroit guys, of course we were listening to what was coming out from Europe, and also what was really interesting, we could hear how the Detroit records were inspiring European records, and how those records were coming back to us. And actually, a lot of our inspiration and my inspiration for the early music was as much from a Derek May Detroit record as it was from a record from Europe that had already been inspired by Derek May. So there was the beginnings of that really global communication and language between all these producers, and that was really interesting. And what we did on the first +8 releases, we actually started to make connections around the world. First with Speedy J in Rotterdam, and and we would put the names around the label because we really felt global. So it would say Rotterdam, Windsor, London, which is actually London, Ontario, Detroit. And that was also the perspective. It was always, let's reach out as far as possible and try to make new connections, be inspired, and be part of this global, this early global electronic scene.
What sort of differences did you encounter with the way the DJs played overseas compared to what you were used to back home?
Yeah, actually, that's a very, very good point, because this mixer I would find quite often around the world. And to the right side, the EQ, which was, I guess, let's say that's the strings of the instrument, especially when you're sculpting sound. They would put screws in the middle there so that you could drop the frequencies, but you couldn't actually attenuate and gain the frequencies in order to protect the sound systems, which there was probably some logic in that idea, but I think that was akin to someone going to do a show, a guitar play, and then someone handing them a guitar with 2 strings and saying, "Okay, now do your repertoire." It was. And it took, for a while we traveled with a screwdriver, and then when the sound guys weren't looking, I'd unscrew them and then go for it. And once promoters started to see the style of how I was playing and Derek and those guys, you started to see more of those mixes actually have that capability again. They stopped putting screws in, or sometimes we actually bought little EQs that we could add on to the thing, and that started to become a style, and part of the kind of the blueprint of definitely of my sound.
Did you realize any differences in the way the blending and actual mixing was approached?
Yeah, I think when we were first going to the UK, it was smoother. Actually thinking about that, I would say the UK and even Europe had a different philosophy in mixing, both as a DJ wise and as in production. At least from Detroit at that moment, because Detroit had a style, Chicago had a style, New York had a style, both mixing and musically. Most of the people I started to meet who were producing in Europe were all using early computers. Everybody had an Atari ST, and everybody was arranging everything. I went into a couple of studios and like, okay, here's my song, and they would press start, and then it would play perfectly on the computer. Basically like the arrangement window from Logic or Ableton now, and that was completely alien to the way I was making music, and again how I had seen music being made in Detroit when I went to Kevin's studio, Kevin Saunderson or Derek's. They just had all these machines lying around, and they were, most of the time, even if you're just like going for a coffee or something, all the machines would be running and music would be kind of bubbling in the background. And then, at a certain moment, they would, I'm going to grab this and press start on the reel to reels and kind of jam for 20 minutes or half an hour. And then afterwards, later, cut, do some editing, but capture that kind of live take. And so again, that comes back to like that mixing and mashing, your frequencies. Everything was very spontaneous. And so now back to the DJ mixing, when you had, that EQ and you're bringing two records together and you're, throwing the frequencies and playing with them, it was also very spontaneous. But everything seemed to be, not everything, there was definitely, people like us, but somehow it was more calculated or,
Well, wir sind die Roboter. What do you expect?
Yeah, well, you said that, so. But yeah, it's, and, so watching and making music like that in the studio, still pretty much to this day, and DJing like that, it was really a philosophy coming from the Detroit guys, and a philosophy of why I've always liked to have as many pieces of equipment in front of me as I play, so that I can spontaneously follow some kind of weird real-time energy.
On those early releases with like your collaborations with like Dan Bell, for example, did you have that specifically in mind, that you would not overload the tracks too much so that you would have the extra headroom to play around with it when you actually play it?
I don't think it was a conscious thing about, yeah. Well, at the end of the day, we were making records that would fit into our DJ set. So, yes, perhaps there was unconscious idea of not having too much information in there and leaving room so that two records came together in a nice way. But I think it was still more about creating music that could be left or played or listened to by itself beyond just a DJ track, and still having enough room to appreciate the sounds that were in there. Especially Dan and I, when we were making tracks together or playing music back and forth, it was always those ones that were more stripped down that we both enjoyed. It was always when, there was space between the kick and the clap and the hi-hats and, different shuffles to also open up little attenuation between sounds that really turned us on. And I also think that, at that time, there wasn't as many possibilities in the computer, of course. We had certain restrictions, either budgetary, because we would go to the pawn shop and buy a $50 303 or something like that to make music with, or we only had 8 channels or I think we had 12 channels on the first mixer that we had, so it was only so much information you could put in there. And even the records I liked at that moment were somehow minimalistic, even pre-making music, Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream. All these records have a very distinct balance within them. So I think it was following that, and there was some times I remember when I first learnt. Everything we were doing was with sync and control voltage and there was no computers in the beginning, and there was no MIDI. So there was only so many things you could, the 808 has 3 triggers out, the 909 has 1 trigger out. So when you have those 2 things running your synthesizers, you only actually can do 4 parts. So you're kind of forced to do that. And then I remember trying to learn MIDI, and for the life of me, I don't know why, I couldn't understand it. I had this crazy little sequencer with a little screen about this big, and it took me, it felt like 6 months, and one day the penny dropped of how all this MIDI stuff worked. And the first thing I did was made all these incredibly complex tracks with 32 different lines and little notes here and there, and I liked it, but quickly I kind of de-evolved back into using a smaller amount of things and just liked music that somehow didn't feel too complicated, and allowed me to kind of just play around within it. I probably said it before. I love music where you feel you can, especially on a dance floor, that there's space between all these sounds. You can kind of climb in there and run around, between the beats. That's a great dance floor experience for me.
How many records did you travel with at that time?
Well, probably 100 to 150. At this time they had these incredible 50 count record boxes. I think the Hardwax was making them from Berlin. And they must have weighed like 20 pounds by themselves. So I think 3 of those, 150, used to take. And that was when I was traveling by myself too. So it would be like the worst thing would be going to the airport and getting out of the baggage claim. Landing somewhere you didn't have the money and you couldn't. It was in that time where all the airports started to charge for their carts, because at one point they were all free, and and try to get out. Once you're outside of the airport, it was okay. There was usually, hopefully, someone there to pick you up. But it was also a different philosophy of I had other DJ friends, and I don't know if that's a European-American difference or North American difference, but who always somehow planned a little bit more, so they could make do with 50 records. But, I always wanted to have lots of different possibilities. And at that moment, I was probably doing more longer shows. So it was typical to play 3, 4, 5 hours or 6 to 8 hours. And you needed different material. And also at that time, I was touring even more than I do now. Sometimes I would do 12 gigs in a row. You try to do 12 gigs in a row with, 30 or 40 records. By like gig 5, you're so tired of the music that you need like a reboot. So it was keeping, myself excited and fresh, so that every night I could go on a slightly different trip, and that I could play well, because when I'm, the more inspired, the more energized, the more excited I am about playing the music I have, the better the show. Even if not necessarily better the show technically, just the better the show is in its flow and my energy and my connection to the crowd, and that becomes a great show, beyond technical considerations.
When did you start taking other human beings along, rather than traveling alone with your record box?
Probably around 98, probably. Around that time, I had moved from. You want to show the next slide? Okay, moved from that mixer to this PMC 50 mixer, which was actually a Japanese-made mixer from Vestax, and was one of the first mixers which had a little kind of effects loop, sending kind of. It was not really. It was kind of like a send it in return. And I was doing this Dex FX and 909 tour and album, and carting records around was one thing, but carting a whole bunch of equipment, at that point it was a 909. A lot of the time we brought our own mixer because not everybody had this mixer, and we also then brought an Ensoniq DP4 effects processor. So that's kind of when I started bringing someone to help me with that. Was still doing kind of the sound checks and everything myself, but it was more about, it was just impossible for me to take on 5 or 6 check-on bags and make it through a tour in the beginning,
And how important is having an actual human being with you that is kind of a sounding board and another social person?
I think now I love traveling with my team. But at that moment, I think it was more of a necessity for the equipment. I love jumping on a plane by myself and getting off at a weird destination for the first time, and I still like that. But it was, and especially as we started to take more equipment and do more rigorous tours, then it became more beneficial to have someone helping and also have someone as kind of a friend and support, because things were just moving at a really high rate. And what's funny about those times was, we were one of probably the first touring DJs who were always bringing lots of equipment. And I remember on that Dex FX 909 tour, we had such a struggle, and the promoters were all complaining, why do you have to bring your equipment? Why do we have to go to the club at 9 p.m. for a sound check? Can't you just show up with your records and play? And we went through that tour, and then after the tour, we never had the problem again. And they were like, make sure Rich brings his stuff. We love we love the show. But it was really everybody at that moment, most people at that moment in the DJ world, whether there wasn't so many festivals or, we're just kind of complacent. It was the mid-late 90s. The scene was huge. And it was like, yeah, just pay the DJs, the $1,000, show up half an hour before. We'll give you a thing of vodka, play, and see you later. You were lucky if you had, transportation sometimes. Most of the time, usually actually, transportation was great before the gig. But then after the gig, it was really like, they're sweeping up the club, and you're like, okay, where was my hotel? And if you were lucky to get back to the hotel, it was at least 50% of the time that when you woke up in the morning, it was like, how do I get to the airport? So luckily things have changed on that. Sound checks, we very rarely do a gig now without a sound check, especially when we get into the larger shows.
What was your rate of minders oversleeping in the morning when you needed to get to the airport?
My rates or...
No, not your rate, but I mean, what quota? Like, how many times were you left in a hotel room and you're like, fuck, how do I get to the airport not speaking the language?
At least I would say in the late 90s, mid 90s, 50% of the time. That's good. Yeah. It was like, amazing gig, high five, see you next time. At the okay. So, yeah.
At what stage did you consider getting representation?
Like management and stuff? Man, I was always adamant I didn't want a manager. I was like, why do I need someone to make my own decisions? It seemed ridiculous, to be honest. But about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, had a friend who had been intertwined in my life and my career on and off since 1994. And he had gone into management and gone into a whole bunch of different things. And at that moment, I was like, there's just too much stuff going on in my life that to handle it by myself. And also because there's so many, even at that moment before he came on, even there was so many projects going on that I was jumping into that it was sometimes really hard to, and I was always writing things down of where I wanted to go next. There was no shortage of ideas, but it was like you would look up and it was like, okay, another year just went by and I haven't been able to even start that other project. And that's where kind of management and even bringing a greater team together comes made sense to me. No, I would, I still have a weird feeling about management too early on. Like there's a big push now. Everyone, wants a manager because everybody else is a manager, and there's all this competition. It's, you need people out there, flying your flag. While you're DJing or while you're producing music or while you're in the studio, And I think for a long time, that was just my friends who were around me, and that worked enough, So I'd be, you need those supporters, you need a couple of flags, but I think you have to be careful who you bring on too soon. Because, especially in the early years, it's very important to find your own creative direction. And you also need to make some bad choices and mistakes before you bring someone on board who may then start, alleviating some of those mistakes or pointing you in the right direction, even though you wanted to go in this direction. And I think that's why finally, I brought my friend Ben on, because I'd already, had, for 20 years created a very strong direction and presence and kind of lineage that I totally understood, he totally understood, and we can very quickly, easily work together at a very high momentum because, things move really, really rapidly in what I'm doing, and just this whole scene now, it's like, just with the way music is distributed, with the amount of gigs around the world, it's very easy for even the newcomer or someone early in their career to start quickly traveling around the world and getting this remix and that remix. And it's, in that way, you definitely need support.
I mean, you've seen different waves of a lot of different stakeholders and interest groups entering our world and disappearing again. And obviously they play by the rules of big corporations and so on. So they would come into a situation with all their personnel and it gets really official. And I guess it's relatively tempting for a young artist to go like, oh, unless I have something similar on my side, I'm not going to get anywhere. What are traps to avoid with your experience?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely that push and that, everyone, you see your friends around you, they've released 2 records, you've released 2 records, but that person's going up higher or quicker because they have representation or something. But, very early on, we had a number of offers to do deals, to buy +8 records completely out, to license our records and do special remixes and make them more commercially successful. And John Acquaviva and I really tried to stay, very authentic and very much in control of everything, to follow our own idea and dream and keep our own identity. And, over those years, we saw other labels come and other artists, and we were always like, oh my God, maybe we should have done something. They're going so high already. Oh my God, they're so successful. Wouldn't it be great to have those opportunities? But at least 50% of the time, a couple of years later, you would look around and those people had disappeared. So it's
like the jocks in high school.
It's like the what?
Like the jocks in high school.
Well, I already said that Derek and those guys were probably more jocks than I am, and they're still around. So,
I wasn't referring to them, but
no,
I mean in
okay.
general.
But yeah, there's no easy way or short way. So many times I've sat there and felt, man, I remember actually when Carl Craig was asked to go on tour with Derek May. It must have been 1989. We were all just starting out. He was going to do one Rhythm is Rhythm live show. And he was working with Derek and doing some records. And I was like, fuck, what? How come Carl gets to do that and I don't get to do that shit? But everything comes to you if you, I think, follow your own pathway and somehow do it on your own terms. Things need time, and don't get frustrated by seeing other people coming up faster or quicker, or that's always going to happen. And that still frustrates me sometimes. And you just get back and focus and take one step at a time, and suddenly it's 1 year later and you've made some kind of development. And that's as long as you're noticing that you're making a development, and suddenly it's 5 or 10, 15, like I've been doing this 25 years. And if I sit down and think about all the things that have happened, it feels, well, that's a long time. But because I'm so focused, it's been an incredible, journey that seems to have just been a little blip. One thing leads to another. You meet another connection, and then suddenly you meet someone. You're like, oh my God, okay, this is the moment where that idea that's been sitting over there needs to come back to the forefront. So if you're not in control of those ideas, or if there's someone leaning on you too much to take you somewhere that you don't want to go, or taking you too fast, or too left or too right, make sure you're working with someone that you trust. Make sure you're working with someone who's listening to you, and make sure that you're still in control of the decision making. Use the people you're working with. Listen to them also, and have a fresh perspective. But don't do something that you don't really want to do, because you're going to do that anyway. We all do stuff that we regret. But if you do, keep moving forward.
Speaking of regrets, by its very nature, temptation comes in very tantalizing forms, and every couple of years, those forms take on massive checks as well. How do you learn to say no?
Yeah, I think that's kind of, there's no easy payday in this type of, well, at least in my type of music. I was reading guys and girls' bios, and you're all doing totally different things, from hip hop to electronic to techno to with vocal experimentation. If you create something and it has greater potential, and someone offers to help you on that, whether it's a tour or whether it's money, or every different project and idea has a different momentum, a different direction, a different destination. And if it makes sense to take a big check or work with a bigger company, then do that. Like a friend of mine, Claire from Grimes, was doing her own independent stuff. She made, using GarageBand and this kind of stuff, and now is signed over to Jay-Z's Rock Nation, and that made sense to her. She wants to reach more people, and I can also understand that. Like, her music is absolutely beautiful. It's also somehow catchy and should be taken to a wider audience.
Didn't she recently scrap the album?
No, no. I think that there was some misunderstanding. She hasn't scrapped the album. So, but every time you go to another level, you're going to find new challenges. And I would imagine that Claire's found new challenges going from a small independent Montreal-based label, to 4AD and now, to Rock Nation. But again, as long as you understand the implications of those decisions, and as long as you have some good people around you to, on the management side, advise you, or on the friend side, support you, you actually, a bit of, I would say, my friend and my management and my team side, those all go kind of together, so it's, you've got to trust your own decision, and you've got to trust the people around you, and then you just got to go for it,
And I guess in those situations,
but one of how I can say no to big checks. I don't get so many offers of big checks. I don't think.
I mean, a big check is a different thing depending on the situation. Like,
yeah, I love being in control of my own destiny and my own career. When I have my own booking agency, I have my own label, and I'm very much hands-on on everything. When we wanted to do a Plastikman show and scale up into this big lighting, video, animation rig, we didn't, try to find the best company to do that. We just found friends around us and made that a new section of our company and built a new team. That's how I like to do it. That's why I'm so, interested since the very beginning of the mixer and the technology I use, and the computers and the creativity of making something or performing, and all the other parts of the puzzle around that, about the lights, about the promotion, about the marketing. Like, all this makes sense to me. All that is part of my creative or output or thought train.
and speaking of business, to the degree that you were at times participating in the business side of the technology as well, right?
Yes, most of the time that has happened when I've run across some type of technology that can help me perform or do something better, and those inventors or technicians need some kind of help, whether that's my support in marketing or just using it, or at times that has also been on an investment level and putting kind of my money where my mouth is. There's actually a good, you want to click through well, it only looks old because I have no hair, but that computer I'm using is an old, well, it's actually a Sony, but that was the first version of Final Scratch, which became Tractor and Serato and all the DVS systems that are out there. And that was running on a operating system called BIOS or BOS. And there was, somewhere along, traveling the world and connecting to interesting and cool people. At that time, my partner, John Acquaviva, met, basically a kid in his bedroom who had hooked his computer up to his turntable and was recording his voice and then scratching his voice and goofing around. And, we just thought it was, as from the very beginning, 10 years of carting 3 crates of 50 records around, with mostly by myself, wasn't the part of the job or my career that I really enjoyed. So to see this technology where we could put MP3s and carry around, well, probably it was about 1,000 tracks at that moment, that was kind of the first the epiphany of why we wanted to be involved in that. So, it was a kid in Mark John in his bedroom with a couple of friends, but they needed some money to boot up that idea and put some more development time into it and create 100 little final scratch boxes. And so we're like, yeah, let's do it. And that's really, because I'm involved in some other technology companies, that's pretty much the ethos today. And if I can, if I put some money somewhere to develop a piece of technology that I can use or software, and it allows me to play better and entertain everyone better, and I have more fun, and maybe I play better because I'm having more fun, it's a success, And so it's not really, it doesn't have to make money. But it's also my belief that if it really does energize and inspire me, that, there's probably going to be more people out there who also want that, or either have thought about that technology or want that technology or are going to need it once they see it. And that's really an exciting circle to be in,
As we briefly cut to commercials, what are those other companies, if you care to tell some of them?
You want to go to another, let's see, I'm working with Livid Technologies. They're from Texas. And they create a lot of very interesting MIDI devices and MIDI components to create your own controllers. So I work with them. I helped develop this called the Control R. And that one's more of a business relationship. If you go back, business as in I'm part of the company. And then I've had a long-standing relationship, non-business, with Alan and Heath, just sharing ideas and trying to, just hang out with them and tell them and show them how I play, hoping that new features will be developed or put into their, new mixers that I can use, having new records in my virtual DJ crate is one thing, but having new knobs and a new push controller also is just as inspiring. It's very hard for me to disconnect music and technology. I think that's been there. That's how I started. Without the computer and this, this is. As a kind of introverted kid, the technology and the computers was the thing that allowed me to reach other people and communicate and reach out beyond what I'm physically able to do.
When Final Scratch was around, it quickly got very ideological. Like, can you elaborate a little bit on that war?
Yeah, that was. You can imagine, like, at that moment, we had +8, we had Minus, as in my record companies, and up until 98, 99, even around 2000, around Final Scratch, we also owned, John Acquaviva and I, a record pressing plant in Toronto. So speaking about big corporations, we were somehow quite vertically integrated. And that was, at that time in America, we couldn't get our records made fast enough. We weren't happy with the quality. So we're like, fuck it, let's buy a record pressing plant, which means buying 2 machines. It wasn't a big operation. But we quickly found out why it was hard to get good quality vinyl, because running machines that have been around for 2 or 3 decades and keeping them all in working order was a huge pain in the ass and a headache. But it was an interesting part of the, of the story. But once we were in the bedroom with Mark Jan, who was developing Final Scratch, we didn't think of the negative implications of the technology. We're just like, we want this now. How long is it going to take to develop? And we just went with it. and as we, I remember when we released the technology and did our first press release, it was like the whole room was just like, wow. Everyone was blown away. And then the penny started to drop. You could see everyone's face go from excitement to horror. And this was at Meet-M, one of the biggest music conferences of the time. And then suddenly we had this huge backlash from all of our friends, who had actually been doing business with for 10 years. Our record store friends were pissed off at us. Our distributor friends were pissed off at us. Some people said they wouldn't carry our records now. It was, a crazy moment in the development because, there was, nobody knew what was coming. It was just like we had unleashed the Kraken, and it was like, okay, nobody's going to be able to control our destiny now. But that was, it was back to the kind of the comment I made about the clubs in the 90s. The whole industry was kind of oiled, and it was just pumping out mostly really good records, but it was an industry. It was printing money, and asking club owners to do sound checks and bringing new equipment in, and then having something that was going to be an alternative to vinyl and or CD, and all these distribution networks and everything that had been set up for years was threatening to a lot of people. But this was also around the time when MP3s and players were starting to come out. I think this was a little bit pre-iPod, but I had just been to an MP3 conference and got one of the first little devices, like a Walkman, and the idea of music being more mobile and being able to have 500 records or 1,000 records in my computer or in my pocket was so exciting that we were like, okay. And this probably comes back to a bit of my personality. I'm a bleeding optimist of how technology can help and transform our lives for the better. I'm not dumb enough to say that sometimes that doesn't go in exactly the right way, but I have to follow that belief for my life, for my performances, for my companies, and follow that path. And that goes back to, managers and all this. It takes a while to really figure out what you want to do with your, I think, life and with your creativity. And even once you've found it, you need to spend some time before all that kind of gels together and you really understand what your mission is. So it's important to have some of that time to yourself on that kind of personal journey before you bring too many people into the works.
On the mere technological side, how do we get from there to all the stuff that you have in front of you right now?
Well, I don't think it's that different in a way to where I began. We'll go through the pictures quick. With my relationship with Alan and Heath. Well, actually, we're not. No, I was going to go through but I can talk through it. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so that's where I'm at now. Yeah, which basically is boiling down how to play with records, how to add on extra percussion, and affect all that in a way that something new and exciting comes through the speakers every time I play, or most times I play, hopefully. So we have, if I quickly explain it, to the left you have Ableton Push, Ableton Push. Then you have the 92 zone mixer. Why I use the 92 is that I think it is one of the best sounding mixers out there, and also the important feature that it actually has 6 channels. A lot of mixers only have 4. And the very important feature is the 2 effects sends at the top, which I can send into the computer, into Ableton, and do flanges and delays and resampling and things like that. Next to it, you have 2 Tractor X1s. These are the older versions, and I kind of like that you have 4 buttons in the middle than 1 or 2 on the newer versions. And then, I have an RME Fireface, and there's lots of audio interfaces out there. There's lots of smaller ones and more convenient, but we've over the years done a lot of testing of what sounds better, and for the price to performance ratio, this thing sounds absolutely incredible compared to some other devices. It handles some of the lower frequencies better than other things. And a lot of the time I'm playing, I have, 4 tracks going on top of each other and some loops. And so the combination of the sound of the 92 and the way you can kind of push that into slight distortion and how the frequencies are handled on the UFX, it handles how I play, really. And that's part of that, finding about who you are or how you're playing or what your pathway is, that this setup isn't perhaps great for everyone, but many people could take the setup and do something completely different. But because of how and why I play, this really is kind of boiled down to giving me the most potential and giving the best audio experience to the listeners. And then on my computer, I'm just running Tractor and Ableton in the background. And yeah, those are... Actually, I don't sync. You can sync both together, of course, via MIDI clock, but I don't. I run, I set the tempos at the same, and then I start Ableton when I play, because some of my tracks are actually mostly, the computer, of course, beat matches, but some of them are out of phase and are, have a different feeling. And so I find when you clock both programs together and you're doing drum rolls on top, it doesn't always sound good. So I actually have a couple of buttons that I can push and pull both tempos independently and kind of find interesting alignments, especially if you're using shuffles or 30-second notes. And that's a little bit, not that we want to get into the DJ, can you mix or beat match debate, but what is nice about putting 2 records together is that they aren't always on time, and you do have some nice slips and push and pull moments between 2 records where really interesting things happen. And so having both of these programs running and having a way to independently offset or unalign the drums that I'm doing and the rhythms and all the records sometimes gives you really, it kind of gives that's the human part that I want to keep in there. There's also, a lot of you use Push, Ableton Push? No, okay. Well, it's, a friend of mine's developed, we have this thing called performance mode, which if anybody wants, they can ask me later and I can send it to them. And if you click, well, you can't see it anyway, but basically it turns all the 64 pads into a direct access of your drum bank so that you can kind of play live and go beyond just 16 drum pads and do all the things that you can normally do in sequencer mode. So if that kind of makes sense to any Push fans, I can show you later. Another piece of interesting technology, which not everybody agrees on, is Oh, I thought it was started. One sec. Well, does anyone know about the radar stuff I'm doing in Twitter DJ? Anyone ever heard of that? Okay, well, yes, no. Well, what we're running here, is it running? Why am I not seeing it at the top? Oh, okay. Yep. Yep, got it. There we go. Thanks. So a couple of years ago, I was with well, anyway, yeah, you know, I think the days of the secret record that makes you a good DJ and better than the person next to you are a little bit over. I really want to push that it's beyond the track you play, or even the tracks, that it's something beyond that. It's the technology you use and how you're playing music. And so I'm very open and, you know, about sharing any kind of software that we've developed, or explaining how all this is working. If anyone wants to see the routing or look at the computer, go for it. And to continue with that transparency, we developed this thing called Twitter DJ, which we now call Radar. And what happens is, as I'm playing my records, it's listening, and anytime I play something for more than, I think, 30 seconds, it actually posts to Twitter. I have an R. Hawtin live account, so if you're at home or if you're in the club, you can actually see what's being played. And then you can also later go to the website called radar.dj and see, you know, the different sets that I've played, and see other users that are actually playing at that moment. So it's a way to share what you're playing, and it can be very useful for promoting the records and helping record companies. And I just like going sometimes to radar.dj. You have this world map, and you can see who's playing live around the world, and kind of start seeing who's playing what. And yeah, it just I love that. I love that feature. I think probably because the world, the electronic music scene was pretty small when I first started. So to see that in real time now, and you know, in all these faraway places, is absolutely incredible.
Does it automatically notify other people when their track is played as well?
It doesn't. Like, I think a lot of producers follow, I think, the R. Hawtin Twitter feed so that they can, you know, see when I'm playing it, because you see people retweeting it. But that's what we, you know, we're continuing the development, and that's what we would love to see, is that, you know, I'd love, as a producer or a record label owner, be able to wake up in the morning and say, okay, your track was played 365 times last night. It was, it seemed to be a high, you know, a hot zone in Chicago because it was played 30 times there. And then use that, you know, to help run your record company better, or just to let people know about new tracks and new producers. Yeah, that's also, because you were maybe bridging onto some conversations earlier about what's happening with the electronic music scene right now. A lot of large corporations are coming in and offering lots of money to buy companies and buy festivals. And being the optimist, I see that there's some great advantages to that, because it's going to help take the scene and grow it to another stage. But at the same time, I think it's very important that we all find the right balance of keeping our independence and staying in control, and taking the right opportunities when they come. And, you know, using this type of technology, radar, and being as transparent as possible, I hope that it allows more people to stay independent, and that we can kind of work together to, you know, keep the scene growing, and with the foundation that we've already created, you know, because why is the electronic music scene so big right now? It hasn't really been because large corporations have helped us, because in the last 20 years, it's basically been small labels and, dreamers and people who have a lot of inspired energy, working together and sharing ideas all over the world, and creating an incredible independent structure. So that the vibrancy of the scene needs to be retained with that somehow. And this is a great forum for that. You guys making connections to all the far corners of the world just in this room. And as long as there's some groups in here and pockets that stay in touch and continue to collaborate or just share their music or ideas, and that can continue to make that mesh of independent, forward-thinking people even tighter and stronger.
I think that's something to marinate on for a second.
Okay.
No.
You guys, you can, because I'm going to be here again tomorrow, but you guys can jump in if you have any kind of questions, because sometimes I'm at these things and on the other side, and you want to ask something, and then when you wait to the Q&A later, it's like, okay, maybe it doesn't actually make sense, and then you don't ask it, and then you're pissed about it for a couple of days. So jump in at any time.
With that whole commercial interest being thrown into our world here, there's also a tendency, because it is more marketable, to put people on a pedestal to a degree, while a lot of it for a long time was about focus on the music and have as little rockisms in there as possible. Now you find yourself on stage quite a bit where, the classic Jesus pose might be the start of.
Yeah, the electronic music world is pretty much working like any other music industry, like the rock industry now. I think it's not exactly the same, but other music industries had been around for so long, and they were doing certain things right, and some of that's been assimilated. When I first got into the scene, if it was the scene is right now, I don't know if I would get into it. I just wasn't. If I was that kid that I was then, I wouldn't have had the balls to try to get up on stage and be a superstar DJ. But I was lucky just that it kind of developed into this bigger scene and into a different type of scene as I was developing as a musician and as a performer. And it's been very kind of natural for me to evolve and develop in how I play and how I perform. It's now we actually have 3 different type of shows. Wow, finally we're getting into it. Why do we're talking about team members, and when we're actually organizing and thinking about where we're playing, we're looking at where we want to go. We're looking at offers and venues, and we have what we call the DJ show, we have the DJ Plus show, and we have the festival show. And these are all to, on everything you were just saying, this is the world that we live in now, which probably somehow, in my own way, I've been a part of developing and becoming less, let's say, I don't know, underground, or let's say coming out from the DJ booth in the corner and going to center stage. I've always liked having as many people listen to my music as possible. Even when I was first doing like a Mayday rave in Germany in 1991 and 1992, and there was like 8,000 people in front of me, I was absolutely petrified. I kind of hated playing those big parties, but at the same time, I loved it if I could get the moment where they were all dancing, and that was, it was like, wow, it can touch this many people. As long as I didn't play something like Carl Craig Bug in the Bass Bin, which was like a prototype of drum and bass, and the Germans didn't like that record at that moment.
Well, not all of them.
Yeah, well, the ones on the dance floor didn't like that moment. So over the years, I've definitely been very open to trying to reach more people. I understand that. Well, I don't think my music is that commercial. I think it has a certain. It can touch more people than I play to at this moment, but it's never going to be a major label kind of big room top 100 and top 10 DJ thing. You know, I love what I do, and I want to stay true to how my sound and how I perform develops, but I want to find ways to get people to come and see me, or you know, go at the festival and say, hey, what's going on over there? I want to check that guy out. Like, sounds kind of interesting. There's a lot of, you know, not necessarily a lot of lights going, but something's happening over there. So that's kind of why we developed these three shows. If I'm in a club, it's the club show, and it's basically Mala, who was just sitting here. It's me and him. We get on the plane with this equipment. We show up. We play for 500 to 2,000 people. And it's, you know, it's about music, you know. Maybe, you know, most clubs have pretty good LED displays and stuff like that, but it's a music experience. And when we get to DJ Plus, we probably scale up on the amount of people. So you're looking at 1,000 upwards of 8,000, 10,000. And we add lights, you know, because every club has lights. But it's always been my belief that if you think about the lights and someone's running the lights who understands how you play, you can make a better experience. I don't think that's rocket science. So that's that. And then we go to festival show, which basically then brings in a visual component. And again, this is like just thinking about a festival experience. There's more festivals now than ever that have great sound systems. But if you're in the middle of a field, you know, no matter, you know, what you do, it's, you know, you need more, you know, you need to add something to the experience to, I think, bring it into a fully well-rounded show. And especially if you have no, delay lines for the sound, and it's all just coming from the front, and you're 15,000 people back, you know, and I'm looking like a little action figure. You know, how do you bring that connection to those people? So then we add on top with the lights, we add Itaro or my other friend Ali Demerol, and bring in a visual component. And again, this is like, you know, if you don't bring your own people, most of these festivals have these big LED shows, the screens behind you. And most of the time, because they've invested in all this money and all these lights, everything is going to be used. And so if you're not in control of that part of the experience, you know, unless you tell them to turn it all off, which they're not going to do, probably, then it's already beyond a music experience. And so we choose to take control of that whole experience and work together so that we have a very distinct aesthetic and synchronicity between what you hear and what you're seeing. Sometimes that synchronicity can be as developed as the Plastikman shows, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, where there's real MIDI data going back and forth to trigger things, or with the DJ shows, having material on both sides that we feel goes together and actually performing together and allowing the visuals to take on more of the feeling of a great musical DJ set. You know, I have my records, Itaro has his visuals, you know, I know kind of what he's doing behind me. He knows, usually how I'm going to begin and end or something, and we try to create, you know, an experience that has moments of synchronicity, but always a continued aesthetic connection together. And for the DJ shows, this is actually, it has to be this way, you know, because I'm getting 1,000 or 2,000 new or demos and records every week or two. I'm going through all this, so we can do we can play a couple of times over a month together, and every show is completely different. So it has to have this flexibility to be able to evolve every time you play.
How do you organize all that music? And how do you stay atop of it?
I oscillate between being very much on top and completely delayed and behind. There's just so much music coming. And honestly, it's very hard to stay on top and give everything the time it needs. I don't have anyone filtering my records, so any demo or any promo that comes in, I listen to. That sometimes is listening sessions of 5,000 or 6,000 records, and I'm going really fast. I just go in iTunes, and it's like, 3-4 seconds. And if something grabs me, I throw it in another crate, and then once I've gone through all the records, I go back to the first crate again, do another 5. You know what I usually do? Then just check that there's nothing, random happening in the song, which you don't want to be too surprised when you're playing. And then I do some very quick meta tagging. Basically, I use the word bomb a lot. And then techno, minimal, tech house, maybe after hours and ambient. And then it goes into the computer, and the next time I listen to it is when I play it. So that's why we can only prepare so much. Partly that's because there's just not enough time to go through everything. But even when I had my 50 records, I would do the same thing. I would go, and then I'd write some notes on it, and the notes kind of helped me navigate. Then the covers helped me navigate a little bit, so I'm a little bit more lost than I used to be, but I have the metadata. But then it was just go play, So sometimes you used to put a record on and be like, okay, that's not the right record, let me find it. And, I can do that much faster with this. So when I'm playing, sometimes I'm quickly pre-listening. And then I just, like Derek May used to do, just jam it in and hope I'm on for a good ride. And if not, I'll loop it or change it or add some percussion on top.
To which degree do you reckon folks feel obligated to just use all those knobs when they're on stage? Because there's a massive stage, you're there on your own, and the knobs are your only friends keeping you company.
Yeah, it's like that. It used to be amazing when you had records, because anytime you didn't know what to do, anytime you needed to have a drink of Coca-Cola or smoke if you smoke, or most of the time for me, just got nervous and didn't know what to do, you just turn around and put your back to the audience. It was amazing. But now I was like, I can't believe this. But that's another part of the development. There was big shows back then, but the amount of bigger shows and productions and things that we're doing now, this all also came out of how the scene was developing. Okay, well, we're not turning our back to the audience now. Okay, so now we're starting to become more like an entertainer. People are watching and expecting us to do something. So, yeah, it's, why do I have, the equipment set up this way? Sometimes, it's not, I like being able to move around the equipment. I like that there's something to watch. I think about this. I'm like, okay, the scene's beyond just people. Well, we have 3 different types of shows. You're still in the nightclub sometimes, and you're with 500 people, mostly with their eyes closed, into a purely music experience. But it's not just about that. So you have to understand that, when you guys get on stage, you're a performer. People come in to see something, and you've got to find your own comfort level of how you're going to be a performer. I'm not saying that you have to do the Jesus pose or, do, crazy shit. It may be that you're, Kraftwerk style and doing everything very precise. But whatever you do is going to be somehow involved in what, kind of sound that you're using, what kind of equipment. So all this comes together. And it also goes back to that point of, maybe not being careful about who you bring on board too soon, who you're traveling with, which manager you have. Because it's got to be really pure. It's got to be honest. It's like when you see, I'm sure we've all seen things on YouTube and photos of DJs or performers where people are saying, okay, what the hell is this person doing? Is that person actually playing? Are they pressing auto sync or whatever? But I think what it is on some of those photos is just the person isn't somehow, being honest about how they play. The equipment should magnify who you are and what you're doing. And if you do that in the right way, then you start really connecting to people in a true way. And people can feel that. If you're trying to go up really fast and you're trying to make a shortcut, someone's going to figure it out sooner or later.
How would young Richie feel if he had done a track, send it to now Richie, and sees on radar that the track's being played, and then listen to the set and go like, hang on, there's about one loop that made it in there and the rest he just used as a basis to fuck around with?
Yeah, that's. I'm sure that happens because there's definitely tracks I'm playing which I only play the first 8 bars, or I don't go after 3 minutes because the track goes in a completely opposite direction. But yeah, it's. I think that's the way I play, and I think once you put out. And I would have been pissed if someone was doing this to one of my tracks earlier on. I think you make a song. Maybe I'm sure there's some producers who make songs that are beats and bass lines, and that's the purpose, and that's great. But there's people putting all your energy and your emotions to, that song and how it develops over 7 minutes. You want to hear it from point A, from the beginning to end, and that's a valid point. But once you put something out into once your baby is released into the public domain or into the industry, I think you have to be open-minded and free with how, what fair usage is, and I think that, the more open-minded you are, I think that's healthy for the industry of people being able to reappropriate and sample and mix and match and see where it goes. I never used to let my music be remixed, but on the new Plastikman album, and Dixon called up. He said, "Hey, Rich, I love this track, but the kick, you can't play it in the club. The kicks shit for a club." Like, well, it wasn't made for a club. It was supposed to listen to on your headphones at home.
But isn't that what he always says?
Well, I thought it was a unique experience with him. So he basically, he said he actually had taken it, put a kick on, and was playing it. And he's like, "Well, can I have the parts so that I can actually make this better? Because I really want to play your track." That's great. So my kick sucked, and he made it better for his usage. And I think that's a good story in that type of situation.
On that note, how did DJ etiquette change on the night? I mean, you were talking about your Mayday experiences, and at that time, there were certain rules about what to play and what not to play, depending on who was on before or after you. And the actual changeover was a lot smoother because it was basically putting your last record on, and the next guy would just take over the next turntable. And
yeah, there's a number of things on that. I think that it still happens in the more commercial side of the electronic music scene, where I hear that people have certain set lists, and you can't DJ before and after can't play this record because that DJ is going to play those 10 records in that order, or at least there's certain things that he or she likes to get to. So it does happen, but I think there's so much more music available now that it doesn't happen as often. But for sure, there's a respect level. Even if I love the Tale of Us remix or track, one of the tracks they did for Minus that I played every set for 8-9 months. If I'm playing before or after them, I'm not going to play that record. That's their record. They should play it. Or I'll ask them. Like sometimes, I don't always like to play my own music. So, but the other part of that, the one thing that I don't like about these type of setups, and especially why we mostly is whenever we can do a sound check, is that our equipment is there set up, and that crossover can be as smooth and respectful as possible. Because the worst thing, like I hate coming on after a DJ and it's like we're forced to like plug in and plug out. Sometimes this happens because you're in a tiny club. But also sometimes we're traveling with some of the other gang from my Minus label, and that actually makes things smoother because we know their setup and we can kind of, they're going to use those 2 channels, and then, they finish, and then I just bring one thing up and we have a nice smooth transition, then they leave the stage and then we finish, things like that. Because it's, you don't want to, It's like when we first started our events on Ibiza called Enter, that was my rule, was that everybody has to go to sound check, set their equipment up, and they can't touch it until the club closes, because I don't want to see anyone other than people dancing in the booth. But that was thrown out on night 1 when we realized there just wasn't space for 4 setups, So gotta, but it's a very important thing to think about, of that respect and the handoff, because it's not as commonplace now for DJs to play these extended 8 or 9, 10-hour sets. There's more larger venues and people putting up lineups of 8 or 10 people. So it's not about, it's not only about one of the artists. It's about that flow. And if you respect that, it actually can heighten the experience for everybody, But then it gets into, when you go into festival shows, that gets into another level of complications, because you're bringing different lights on, and this DJ has this LED display and this one has that. And then it can get into a show off of who's going to have more lights and this and that. And so there is a lot of complications and challenges that you start to get into as you scale up on any of these shows.
Like my man Puff saying, more money, more problems. Yeah. On that note, we are talking about the visual side of it, as you hinted at, tomorrow. And we'll talk about how to match what's happening sonically with what you're actually seeing. But are there any specific questions on the DJing part that we should answer now?
Or anything with what we've talked about, DJing, companies, controllers, or random. I'm totally open.
Hi, Richie. Thank you very much for being here, telling us all this. For me, the Shit One record is a pretty special record. It's one of those records you play when you come up from the disco, from the club, just to chill out and relax. And for me, it's very special, the trippy sounds and everything. I was wondering, you growing up going always to Detroit and playing this hard, fast and powered techno, with John Acquaviva. How do you make the transition? How do you stop, take that time to build that record and just actually understand it and put it out? How was that time?
Yeah, at that moment, there was a lot of things going on. In 1993, there was a lot of great 12 inches coming out with good club tracks, more banging techno records. And there was people making CDs and compilations, and everyone was doing an album, but all the albums were just these club tracks, 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of a greatest hits. And I didn't feel that it was very inspiring, to be honest. You know, it was like at the club, I loved hearing those tracks, but when I went home, I wanted to have a different experience. And probably Sheet One also was related more to the end of my sets in Detroit, because I would always play 6, 7, 8 hours. And the last 2 hours were always really magical. Just before the sun was coming up, a lot of the, you know, we're only talking about 400 or 500 people, but a lot of the people had maybe left, and you're there with like 100 people, which pretty much you knew everybody. And then you could start playing records slower, or I used to later on play one of my tracks, Panic Attack, at the normal speed, and then later slow it down with my hand, and then play it at 33. And everybody was like, why it's called Plastikman. Everybody was starting to like, everyone was loose, everybody was hallucinating, and yeah, really open to frequencies and rhythms. And that's really where that record came. It was for that moment after, you know, if that club night had continued for another 2 or 3 hours, if people had lost, kind of finished their energy of dancing, but still wanted to keep hearing, and they were lying on the dance floor, you know, as the sun came up, that was kind of the record for them, you know. The rhythm was there, kind of like the echoes of the night, and then there was just like the bubbling acidic lines that were kind of more for the brain. So yeah, it's a very, very Detroit record.
This is more on the production side, but you were talking about how the people from Detroit and also you were doing less arrangement on the computer, and we're really like using machines and recording live takes and then editing them. I was wondering, like with a track like one of the Plastikman, like with Spastic or something, how much of that is edited down? Just because I work kind of the same way, and I always wonder how deep to get into editing.
Yeah, that's there's a cross point where too much editing becomes like arrangement, you know, and you know, there's still tracks in the archives that I tried over and over again to release, but I could just, it always, the live take just wasn't good enough, or there wasn't enough good parts, or once you put it together, you started to hear, it just changed the feeling. So, you know, I remember Spastic was, I think, 28 minutes long.
Oh.
But there was really, I think, 3 edits or 4. You know, it was basically intro, and then 6.5, 7 minutes of one take, and then outro.
Uh-huh.
And then, you know, it was, and if you're really into it, you play a long time. I have 2 DATs of a track called Overkill by Circuit Breaker, which was on my Probe label, and the take was an hour and a half. That took a long time to edit. In the end, there was only 2 or 3 edits again, but it was like, oh my God, I love this part. I was like, oh my God, I love this part. It's like, well, it can't be 20 minutes long. Well, except I did a System 7 remix once, and I think that was 18 minutes because I loved it all. So it's like, fuck it.
Yeah, I have like 30 hours of an album from like a week, right? And I just don't know where to. It's too much.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. Things should need as little editing as possible. You don't want to fuck with that human feeling, especially, and that's why I like doing it that way, because there's so much computer and technology involved in what we're doing that you have to find that right balance of man and machine. Much in the way that all my things aren't really synced. I like that for me, and much in the way that like the newest Plastikman album was more of an Ableton album, but it was basically captured live when I played it at the Guggenheim. So I had to think about it a little bit more than what I would have done in the old studio days when it was all machines. But I tried to then set something up so I could just jam it and play it. And then I think it was 68 minutes, and I threw one song away and brought it down to like 54. So there was probably about 10 to 12 edits in the hour, to make it feel still live. That's yeah. It shouldn't sound like there's editing. And also back then we weren't using computers. It was all tape editing, which was really fun because you had all these pieces around on the wall taped up, and then you had to remember which were which. And yeah.
Besides the MP3, CD, and vinyl transition or different worlds or realms, how difficult was to you to get along with DJs that are strictly into beat matching? There are DJs that do not consider another guy as a DJ if he's not doing the queuing and the specifically beat matching thing, and when you when you went all digital, like I think you got rid of it. Using that technology, you managed to get rid of that part of the DJing. So how could you get along with DJs that weren't into that because I think at the early 2000s or something like that, everyone was so critical about it, and because there were like two different things.
Yeah, no, for sure. I didn't actually move to fully in the box and away from control vinyl, and probably for about another 4 or 5 years after Final Scratch and everything came out. I think one of the big things for me was when they went to 4 decks, so that I could start to find, a different type of creativity. Then, I don't actually think, general beat matching, I don't think is very creative, to be honest. I think it's just a skill. Some people definitely are pushing and pulling, and then you get into scratching, and that's a totally different thing, an incredible thing. But I was worried about, what people were going to say and how it was going to feel. The actual thing that pushed me over the edge was really the technology not being stable enough. With very early versions of Serato and Traktor, you would plug everything in and then it wouldn't, calibrate and things like this. And I was, I always do all my a lot of the time I do a lot of my new thinking and development of how I'm going to play in January, February, and March, because it's the time I take off every year. I can play with everything and I can slowly ramp up and be prepared for when my gigs start, usually March or April. And on whatever year this was, 2005, 2006, my last gig of the year was in Venezuela. And, I think I've played 3 times in my life in Venezuela, in Caracas. And all these people were there waiting for me to play. Everybody was super excited, and my fucking shit wouldn't calibrate. And so I was like, okay, what do? Just blame it on the technology and have a beer and say sorry, see you next time? So I was like, okay, fuck, auto sync this shit, do it in the computer and do the set. And, people were happy that I was there, and they didn't know what was going on. And in a way, a lot of people probably didn't care exactly what technology was being used. I was playing the music that I liked somehow, sort of in my style. It was a bit shaky because it was the first time I did it. And I was like, yeah, I never went back. I was like, now I know I can, there's also problems with this technology. You never know if it's, you can also have problems like the scratch. But that inspired me to just go back at home and, start playing with this stuff and trying to develop where I could go next with DJing. I definitely played differently. sometimes we didn't really answer that point. Sometimes you can get into too many knobs and get too much into it. Sometimes I listen to a set, I'm like, okay, I was fiddling around too much. My brother and my girlfriend call it noodling. Sometimes I'm noodling too much, and so you have to find that balance. There's always, since that time, there's always been people, blasting me for beat match, or not, for making this choice. But yeah, I want to be challenged and inspired continually. So I choose to do it this way and continue to be energized and perform. And the way my choices aren't right for everybody, but I feel that I do something unique, and I'm just going to keep following that pathway and see where it takes me. I probably, in the early days, I would have never thought I would have left turntables. I'd spent 15, 20 years on turntables, and then you're like, oh, throw it away and start again. Even if it's beat matching for you, there's still a lot of other things to do. But that's a great thing about all this stuff, all this technology. You never know where it's going to take you. So there was one other part of the question. And most of the comments now from at least my generation of DJs and colleagues is just kind of taking the piss. I was playing for New Year's Eve 2 years ago, and with my very good friend Sven-Väth, who is an adamant hardcore vinyl lover. And it always, like, when I'm in the same booth with him, he always rolls his eyes when he sees my computer. He's like waiting for something to go wrong, probably. And I had a complete meltdown of my computer on New Year's Eve, right when I was playing after Sven. He was supposed to fly off somewhere else, and he was so pissed. But he was also like, he was like, told you, come back to the dark side, or whatever the side that is. So it's all fun and games, Sven is as a good example. He's followed his path and his dream, and he selects music in a completely different way than me. He plays some records that sometimes I'm like, how could he play this record? And I'm sure he does the same with me. He uses the same mixer, but in a completely different way. But he's following his path and his dream. He has his authenticity. He has his style, and that's why he's Sven-Väth. He's a crazy motherfucker, but he's dedicated to that way. So I'm dedicated to this way.
Well, thank you.
We have one more in the back, and then I guess we continue tomorrow.
Yeah, this is a simple question. I mean, you have so many different activities. How much time do you find to make music?
Not enough time, for sure. Good question, especially as we're sitting, in Japan, the land where people follow one craft and perfect that over a lifetime, which I very much respect and admire. To find the balance between all the different projects is very complicated. I definitely don't have enough time to make music, but it would be very hard for me to drop any or all the other projects, because they all have some kind of weird, at least in my mind, synchronicity and connection to each other. And I love all these things going on. And I think, if you love what you do and you're inspired, that energy really gets transferred, and that also comes into how I'm playing and things like that. And especially being involved, I was also involved in Beatport in the early days, and I try to keep as many of the projects somehow connected to the music or how I'm going to play, or I'm working on a project right now which is a hardware project, which will, I hope, inspire, new DJs, and I love being part of all that, So probably there's only be more projects and not less. But so, and one of the greatest things of what happened to me last year was that I squeezed a month off in between some days, and I was in the studio and did the Plastikman album, and I would love to find more time to do that. And what I think that taught me is that I struggled to find the time and make music in the way that I used to make music. And that just wasn't realistic, because in the early days I had all my machines and boxes, and it was in one location, and I could just, go downstairs and spend 48 hours or 3 weeks on music. But it's not possible right now. And so the last album was created basically in the box, which took me a long time to climb into. It was really a nightmare for me to make music just on a computer. It was really uninspiring in the early days. I was so against looking at the arrangement window, but somehow I found a way, and I'd love to explore that more. And I think now it's more possible, because I can sit in front of my computer now in a hotel room and at least work on something. Or, I do have time off, but I'm not always by my old studio. So now that I've kind of unshackled the chains of needing to be in that physical mixer in front of me, 909 here and 303s here and Dave Smith's instruments there, I can continue to work wherever.
I guess this is your call to get to work yourselves, and not without thanking the man for sharing with us.